last research panel is diverse, a diverse group of presentations, but perhaps what links them together is the idea of the past and how it impinges on the present, how it comes together with the present. And I think all of these papers speak about how the past, in the form of the Holocaust, in the form of persecution which took place in the past, has meaning in the present context. We have 3 presentations, and I've asked them to keep their presentations to about 20 minutes so that hopefully we'll have some time for dialogue at the end. The first presentation is by Michael Dorland, who's a professor of communication in Carleton School of Journalism and Communication, and he specializes in rhetoric, public speech, and, as he says, related dilemmas in communicative possibilities and impossibilities. Before coming to Carleton, he was a research fellow at the Université du Québec and at Duke University in the U.S. He has an extensive record of teaching before coming to Carleton in 1992. He also worked as a journalist and editor and published and is published as a novelist in 1978. He's the author of several books on the cultural industries in Canada and on comparative law, and his most recent book, 2009, is called Cadaverland, Inventing a Pathology of Catastrophe for Holocaust Survival. And it's on the communicative dilemmas of Holocaust survivors in France, Israel, the U.S., and Poland. He's also currently the editor of the Canadian Journal of Communication. Michael?
Thank you, Allan. And brave souls who've stuck it out to this point. I hope it's worth it. As you see from your programs, the title of what I'm trying to do here, and I'll just jump into it, and I will not take up 20 minutes, less as opposed to more. I don't recall exactly when the idea of a curse attached to, working on the Holocaust came to me. It's hardly a new or novel or unique idea, if you think back to Adorno's curse on writing about the poetry is impossible after Auschwitz. If you think of the suicide of so many survivor writers, from Borowski through to Primo Levi, anyway, in my case it was sort of late in the process, I think, of the 10 years I spent researching and writing the book. So, what struck me about this idea when it occurred to me was that the idea of a curse or cursedness was so utterly foreign to the spirit in which I tried to write Cadaverland, which is basically a study of the refusal, or at least immense difficulties, of medical professionals to understand Holocaust survival, except as a pathology. Even Professor Annisman's presentation this morning, excellent as it was, is a kind of illustration of understanding something predominantly as a pathology. I tried to write the book in a spirit of as much lucidity as I could, bring to bear. I carefully chose examples that, as fully as possible, could bring home the utter incomprehension of both survivors and the few medical practitioners that they encountered. I tried to show the limits to understanding of the various helping professions concerned, or, in some Foucauldian sense, of bodies of knowledge and different bodies of knowledge. Cadaverland was modestly well received within the field of Holocaust studies. Even some historians seemed inclined toward praise. They can't actually praise, but they can kind of lean that way. Anyway, as a difficult academic book, it did perhaps as well as one might expect. It got some traction even among training psychoanalysts. And then it hit a wall. That strange land outside the narrow specializations we toil in that in their own way resemble the enclosed spaces of detention and incarceration we write about. What does it take for a book to break out of that cursed space to the wider reading public beyond? And obviously there are many, many completely uncontrollable factors here at play, so I want to attempt in this presentation to discuss three of them. One of the main ones that Cadaverland itself analyzed was the process, roughly 60-some years, the process of reversal away from pathology to its opposite. Too often an unreflexive celebration of the nobility and heroism of survivors who made successful lives for themselves, and most often in America. After all, some, a few, maybe many, Professor Annisman had it at about 20% this morning, survivors were not irreparably, irrevocably damaged by their camp experience. And this surprising finding eventually began to show up in the psychological literature as of the late 70s or thereabouts. From the vantage point of 50, 60 years later, being a Katsetnik was seemingly almost as fun as it is in the disgraceful Benini film. It's no doubt in the nature of things to flip into their opposites. Years of suffering can perhaps change into an understandable desire for more levity. Doesn't mean you necessarily get it, and also ideas that take root in one context can often find a warmer welcome in another. Cadaverland examined this in a number of different contexts. The idea of shell shock that was rediscovered with every subsequent war since, I don't go back to the American Civil War if you want, World War I if you'd rather, or the unbelievable finding, for another example, as of the 1948 war, that Israeli soldiers also suffered from combat trauma. Every time. Well, it's impossible. Well, no. Research on Holocaust survival would be the thread leading to the examination of, if you want to call them this, larger problems, such as of post-nuclear survival. What happens if they drop the bomb on each other and so forth? What then? Or that the traumatic effects found in concentrationary survival studies were replicated in an odd kind of transference in the memory syndromes of rape and child abuse. And, again, we saw, this well shown earlier today. And such a wandering of ideas, again, from one context to another, is no doubt to the good, although often at the cost of erasing their specific roots in the Judeo side to become a more general phenomenon within the wider culture. I mentioned that Cadaverland was a difficult book, and it is in several ways, because of its discussion of historical trends in neuropsychiatry and psychoanalytic theory and rhetorical theory and so forth. So a second factor, I forgot my water. So a second factor, possibly, in the book's inability to break out of its specialization, or I'd say its multiple specializations, is that it's a book that makes the reader cry. There's no happy ending. I myself did a fair bit of crying in the research and writing phases. And how can one not without remaining honest to the material? One small example that's perhaps more funny in a way, but also so utterly sad in its incomprehension, is this. The French Ministry of POWs and Deportees, just after the war, and obviously by the war I mean World War II, had the returnees fill out a questionnaire about their experience. But the questionnaire was more the kind of thing tourists might be expected to respond to, not concentration camp survivors or POWs. Like questions like, how was the food? And were the accommodations satisfactory? And, what was the attitude of your hosts? So someone would write in, méchant, very seriously. This was like, a large stack of yellowed papers in the Sully part of the French National Archives. There are other passages, and obviously these are things that I used quite deliberately in the book just to try and be as precise as possible. They just make you cry. I mean, there's no other response. The small, shriveled, paper-thin heart of a Mussulman at autopsy, for instance. A number of friends have told me that the book was too emotionally wrenching to be able to be read at one sitting, if at all. One friend said, you read your damn book and you want to blow your brains out. So, okay, great. That's good for sales, anyway. But I wasn't writing a comedy, nor a book with a happy ending. On the contrary, it's a book about the all-too-human limits of scientific or medical knowledge, encountering other forms of human experience so extreme as to be beyond the normal scales of understanding, including those of scientific understanding. And this misencounter is a tragic one. Medical knowledge is about medical knowledge, and its understanding is to produce more medical knowledge. It's about cortisol levels, measured in test subjects. Okay, that's what it's about. And do they vary and go up and down and things like that. It's not about human suffering. And rarely do the two encounter each other. Medicine or psychiatry or psychoanalysis can sometimes bring some relief, or not. But like the poor, human suffering is always with us. That the subject matter is difficult or painful, however, is not a sufficient reason for concluding that Holocaust research is a form of curse. There are a great many very fine books about the Holocaust, though they are rarely fun to read. Many, too, have become the source of complex, enduring controversies. It took about 40 years for Hannah Arendt's book on the Eichmann trial to be translated into Hebrew, for example, because she'd said, what she said about the Judenland. So, does it have something to do with the fact that writing about the Holocaust confronts the writer, us, with the bottomless pit of the human capacity for evil, with all its horrid fascinations? Perhaps. And yet Arendt's book on Eichmann, just as an example, among other claims, argues that the nature of evil in bureaucratic modernity has transformed itself into the banal actions of killers with desks. And along with that, the banalization of language that is the accompanying component of what Adorno famously called the administered life. What can one say about horror, if not the horror, as in Conrad's Heart of Darkness? The British writer Jeff Dyer, in his moving book about the cemeteries and memorials of the Great World War I battlefields, comments on the meaninglessness of phrases such as the horrors of war. The word horror, he writes, has no power to horrify. The more you pile it on, the faster linguistic wear proceeds. Still, away from the desks, the horror of having to actually shoot hundreds of thousands of Jews with pistols or machine guns took a dreadful toll on the bloody poor perpetrators, leading to the new, improved form of evil that became like mass gassing, which, unlike in World War I, at least according to Dyer, the Zyklon B, etc., was intended to kill outright and not just to maim, as in mustard gas and chlorine and all that sort of thing. Given the protein forms of evil, these do not have to always take dramatic proportions, especially not against the broader background of the banalization of modern life. It is no exaggeration to say that whatever the country, it was very soon clear that nobody, with a few exceptions, wanted to hear about the Holocaust. Not even, eventually, as they quickly got the message, the survivors themselves. And this was so in a country like France, where the number of survivors were tiny, about 3,500, compared to millions of repatriated former POWs. Excuse me. It was also the case in Israel, where 1 in 4 post-war Israelis were themselves survivors, which is why it took decades for some kind of recognition of survivor experience to take hold. Decades. And the actual magnitude of the Holocaust camp infrastructure is still being uncovered some 70 years later. Not a few hundred camps, as was largely believed for so long, but tens and tens of thousands of them throughout the Reich, according to a recent and rather strange New York Times story that I won't get into. We're up to about 50,000 and more. Just to give you a very rough idea, if you can, it's just a question of looking at the dots. This is from the United States Holocaust Memorial Encyclopedia, and that's about 20,000, right? So 50,000 rising. In France, which Cadaverland focuses upon most, since the French case is a complicated and protracted one, in some ways more so than Germany's. In France, then, the power of denial took hold very quickly. Between May 45 and March 48, there occurred what the writer... sorry, something stuck in there. There occurred what the writer Robert Antelme called a veritable hemorrhage of publications about the concentrationary universe. A veritable hemorrhage means a couple of hundred books. And these were mainly of the I Return from Hell variety. And yet as early as January 1946, publisher interest was already waning. Enough cadavers, enough torture. We want to laugh now, was how one writer paraphrased what a number of editors were saying. What work persisted occurred in specialized medical journals and in medical dissertations, focusing largely on what was called the pathology of deportation, on the one hand, and then of the deportees themselves, of which there were many manifestations. The list got longer and longer. Some writers and former deportees, notably David Rousset, Jean Améry, actually the Viennese-born Hans Meyer, another suicide, and then Robert Antelme, were able to write and publish about the camps within 2 years of their return. Others, like Charlotte Delbault, wrote for the desk drawer and would not be published until, several decades later. Above all, and as Antelme famously put it of his return from Buchenwald-Gandersheim, we were all of us seized by a veritable delirium. We wanted to speak, to be finally heard. We had just returned. We had brought back with us our memories, our experience, and we felt a frenetic desire to tell it as it had been. But they told us that our physical appearance alone was quite sufficiently eloquent. Thank you. Nobody back home wanted to hear what the returned had to say, what the returned were burning to say. The increasing distance between the homes they thought they had come back to, including the home of language, became a suspicion of language itself. Because, as Antoine remarked, we were still there in the camps. But their bodies were now home again, and what they had to say would instead take the form of bodily symptoms, some of which eventually came under medical scrutiny, and again, Jaime's various pies was pretty good in terms of the list of major organ system pathologies. So anyway, this idea of a symptom may also be a form of clue to the kind of isolation Cadaverland found itself in. I mean, which was personally surprising, but anyway. Too identified, perhaps, with the survivors and the attempts to rescue a range of alternative Jewish medical perspectives in the work of such Jewish doctors in different kinds of understandings of the term, from basically PhDs to medical and so forth. So people such as, I just mentioned their name, I'm sure you've never heard of them, maybe one, Isidore Simon, Marek Dvorzhetsky. He changed his name when he ran for the Knesset in Israel, and was the first holder of a chair, of the world's first chair in Holocaust studies at Dorland. Henri Baruch, who was a noted psychologist and head of the Charenton Asylum, and others. I mean, I just wanted to mention their names. So the sort of range of alternative Jewish perspectives in the work of these people on the pathologization fixation of Western medicine, and they were claiming, looking at Jewish medicine, that there were other ways to go about this. Perhaps the book itself was, more than anything else, also a kind of symptom. Certainly a couple of prospective reviewers, one, were struck by this aspect of the book, namely that it was, in some respects, more a form of self-analysis of my issues with my French-Jewish question, which is how the book starts out. In writer Henri Racimovitz's words, the post-Holocaust French Jew dwells in, quote, a cloud of neurosis in which the individual cannot orient himself. He must discover his own path. Through one of the perverse tricks that history plays on us, he experiences it as a kind of déjà vu. And so perhaps that is the curse, not of Holocaust research per se, but more so of the research, of the researcher, him or herself, who, on some level, as a Jew, must discover a fresh path through what is experienced as déjà vu. And yet it does also apply to Holocaust research as well, or Shoah research. You never know whether to get into these things. Anyway, to Holocaust or Shoah research as well, and the reasons for undertaking it, whatever they may be. If not now, is the ancient question that this conference explores. It is also the question that has animated Holocaust research since soon after the camps were liberated, if not before, in hidden manuscripts discovered afterwards. It is still the question. Thank you.